In the healthy control subjects, these molecules were at this level at baseline before the exercise, then the exercise on a treadmill, and 30 minutes, 8 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours after exercise, there was indeed an increase in several of these molecules, clearly triggered by exercise. In chronic fatigue syndrome, there was also an exercise-triggered response, but these are the same, the ordinates here are the same magnitude, but as you see, there were dramatically higher levels of many of these molecules in the CFS patient groups than in the healthy controls. So exercise did something different, objective, measurable, and different in the patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. Pass by that. Studies of the immune system. I'm summarized a very large literature to say, at least my own synthesis of this literature is that the majority of groups that have looked for it have found increased numbers of circulating cytotoxic T cells that are activated. They bear various activation antigens on the cell surface. That function of natural killer cells is impaired. That a system, the 2,5-A enzyme system, is upregulated in the lymphocytes of these patients, and that there is increased production of several pro-inflammatory cytokines in chronic fatigue syndrome. This is a study that we published 20 years ago now, in which we studied 20,000 laboratory tests collected from 700 patients over a course of 10 years. Patients and matched healthy control subjects. The number of patients who had circulating immune complexes was 27 times as frequent as in the healthy controls. The number with elevated levels of immunoglobulin G, 9 times as frequent, and a possibly related finding, the number with increased numbers of atypical lymphocytes, 11-fold greater than in the healthy controls. These are the actual data on immune complex levels. As you can see, in the controls, they were all where they're supposed to be by normative standards, and in the cases, some of them were at normal low levels, but there were quite a number of cases with elevated levels. The cytokines most frequently related to chronic fatigue syndrome are increased levels of TNF-alpha, IL-1, multiple members of the IL-1 family, IL-6, and interferon gamma. There's also been reported by several groups increased TGF-beta, which is thought to be a response to try to downregulate the pro-inflammatory cytokines that are found to be produced in increased quantities. This is the upregulation of the 2,5-A system. This is a system which is thought to be a primary antiviral mechanism in infected lymphocytes. And the two end products of this enzymatic cascade are 2,5-A and 2,5-A dependent RNAs. Those levels in the patients with CFS are clearly different than in controls. CFS, controls. Studies of infectious agents. As I say, the patients, many of them, but not all of them, say this all began with some sort of infection, some sort of infectious syndrome. So what infectious agents might be involved in this illness, and where do we stand in our understanding of that? My own view is that it is very plausible that infectious agents can trigger and perpetuate this illness, but there's no proof of that yet with any infectious agent. That most of the agents that have been associated with this illness share two properties. First, they can't be fully eradicated by the immune system. We are infected with them all of our lives, those of us who are infected with them. And most of these infectious agents are capable of infecting the central nervous system. There's now solid evidence that CFS can follow a new infection. I'll show you one study that does that very well in my view. And it's possible that in CFS, in fact, the symptoms reflect an interaction of several agents that trigger each other. And there's some proof of that. This is what I thought was a tremendously important study organized by the US CDC, but conducted in a small community in Australia, where this is an agricultural community, a very few doctors, one hospital, I believe, one laboratory. Everything that happened to the health of the citizens in this community was captured by this very small group of health professionals. And every single case of documented new EBV infection, Q fever, or a local virus that's it doesn't have widespread global distribution, Ross River virus, every case was followed for at least 12 months, many longer. And they found that 11% of the patients infected with these agents developed CFS. And that CFS was more likely to occur in those patients who initially had severe clinical symptoms and who initially had higher production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, ex vivo production. They also studied these patients at the time they first became acutely ill to characterize their psychiatric status, not only at the moment that they had become ill, but looking backwards at their prior psychiatric history, and looked at their demographic features and could find no pre-morbid psychiatric or demographic factors that predicted who would go on to chronic fatigue syndrome. The only predictors were the immunologic predictors. What are the infectious agents that have been linked in multiple studies to chronic fatigue syndrome? These are they: Epstein-Barr virus, as you know, a ubiquitous human herpes virus that infects 90 to 95% of the human race. Post-Q fever, or Coxiella burnetii infection, Ross River virus, the spirochetal bacteria that causes Lyme disease, parvovirus, enteroviruses, Borna disease virus, perhaps. I should put question marks on that. There's been several studies that have not found that, including one here from Dr. Evangard. Human herpes virus 6, a virus I'll say a little bit more about, and in the last 2 years, a speculation that a group of mouse leukemia viruses, retroviruses, might be related to CFS, which at the moment, I must say, looks as if it has been very seriously challenged and is probably not the case. Human herpes virus 6 is a virus that I spend a minute or two on, in part because I've been interested in studying it, but also in my judgment, I think there is considerable evidence that it is reactivated in patients with CFS more often than in healthy controls, and has many features that could make it an agent that could trigger this syndrome. It infects a remarkably wide variety of cell lines. Unlike most viruses, it's tropic for many neural cells, epithelial cells, gut and respiratory epithelial cells, and all of the white blood cells. It is a common cause of febrile seizures in infants after primary infection, which in most people is in very early years of life, it remains in the CNS. It causes encephalitis in immunosuppressed and in immunocompetent patients, something that has just become apparent the last 3 years. It causes demyelination in immunosuppressed and some immunocompetent children. It has been associated with multiple sclerosis, a growing literature that now is nearly 100 studies that suggests it might be one of several triggering agents. And in the last few years, studies from the NIH that have linked it to temporal lobe seizure disorders. This was a study that we did. I showed you the MRI results a little while ago of an epidemic group, an endemic group of patients with this illness, matched controls, age and sex. Most of them had reactivation of this virus in peripheral lymphocytes versus a minority of the controls. It was a highly significant difference. That doesn't by any means prove that this virus is related to the syndrome, but it does say, as other studies have, that it is reactivated more often, and that could, particularly since it is a virus capable of infecting the CNS, the central nervous system, it could be related, an etiologic agent in this illness. Our studies of this virus were not just antibody studies, but with polyclonal antibodies, also monoclonal antibodies, DNA in situ cytohybridization, looking for viral nucleic acid, and electron microscopy. Most of the studies, but not all, that have reported an association between this virus and chronic fatigue syndrome have found such an association. The patients in the studies that have found an association are 1,000 patients. The patients that have not found an association, many fewer patients. Energy metabolism and oxidative and nitrositive stress. I'm going to say just one thing very quickly. There is a picture emerging that I put together this way, that activation of this critically important transcription factor, NF-kappa B, leads, which is central to the inflammatory response, particularly the response to infectious agents, leads to increases in COX-2 and INOS that goes on to cause oxidative stress and nitrositive stress as reflected by multiple different manifestations. That these two types of stress damage nucleic acids and lipid membranes, damage mitochondrial nucleic acids, leading to a preponderance of anaerobic metabolism, increased lactate. Showed you a minute ago the spinal fluid lactate measurements in CFS patients. Dr. Watanabe, I'm sure, is going to talk a lot about this, and that's therefore all I will say about it. So, in summary, the biology of this illness, I believe, involves the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, is associated with a state of chronic immune activation, as if the immune system is attempting to attack something it recognizes as foreign. That there is oxidative and nitrositive stress that is possibly secondary to this state of immune activation. That energy metabolism is impaired, possibly as a function of the mitochondrial damage done by this, and that infection can trigger the illness in many, if not all, patients. I think that's now, there's a lot of evidence for that. Whether that infection that triggers the illness goes on to perpetuate it, I think we really don't have much information either way. So in closing, my answers to the first two questions that I began with Do we understand the causes or pathogenesis of this illness? No, we do not. But are there objective biological markers that are abnormal? Markers that are not the products of any patient's imagination, but objective biological markers? I believe the answer is yes, and therefore my answer to the question, is chronic fatigue syndrome real, is that it surely is real. There are probably several million people in the developed nations of Europe, Scandinavia, the United States affected by it. And it is an illness that, as clinicians and as biological scientists, we should take very seriously, and about which we have a lot more to learn. Thank you very much. Please. Yes.
Yes. Do you know if there is any connection with autoimmune diseases in relatives to the patients? Anything like that?
There has not been a good study that compared the patients to a matched control group in terms of the family frequency of autoimmune diseases. It's my impression as a clinician that there is a higher family incidence of autoimmune diseases. There are many papers that have found autoantibodies to various tissues in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. But some of those papers have subsequently been challenged pretty seriously. So I don't really know right now that we can say that there's evidence in even some patients of an underlying smoldering autoimmune process, but I think it's entirely plausible.
Can you hear me?
I'll repeat your question if not.
You talked about the white matter abnormalities.
Yes.
And some of the other SPECT studies. What is this pathology reminiscent of? I mean, is it reminiscent of something that we can, take clues from?
Yeah. Well, there are two questions. The question that was asked is, do we understand the underlying pathology of these MRI abnormalities and SPECT abnormalities? The MRI abnormalities look a lot like in what you see in animal models of post-infectious inflammatory syndromes. They also look like, but somewhat less numerous than the white matter abnormalities seen in certain post-infectious demyelinating conditions, transiently demyelinating conditions that affect human beings. So they are visibly like those abnormalities, but no one has gone in invasively to sample tissue in a living human brain from that tiny little spot that shows up on MRI. We really don't have enough brains that have been collected to say much about what the pathological correlate is. Yes?
Is there any connection between CFS and the so-called burnout syndrome, syndrome, or stress-related depression? What is the connection? Is there any connection?
Well, I don't know a lot about that syndrome. My understanding, though, is that it is an illness that develops quite slowly over the course of weeks, months, years, does not develop acutely. In most of the patients I have seen with chronic fatigue syndrome, as I've said, the illness is unambiguous. It began, you ask me, when did this begin? And sometimes they will give you a date. It was February 2nd, 1985. I'll tell you exactly what I was doing. And so I think the acuteness of the onset is what first attracted me to try to study this illness, because it certainly didn't sound like a psychiatric illness or even a stress-related illness. It just started to acutely. Having said that, not all of the patients who meet the criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome, in not all of them did it begin so suddenly. In most, 80% of my patients it did, but not everybody. Are those patients different? Are the ones where it did not begin suddenly different? We've looked at all of these biomarkers in the two groups. We can't find any difference. Yes?
Is it common with seizures among children with... Can you all hear? No.
The question was, are seizures common in children with this illness? And I think the answer is no. There have not, seizures, certainly febrile seizures are very common in all children, but I don't think there's any recorded evidence that seizures are more common in this illness. On the other hand, that is complete seizures with motor abnormalities. Many of the adults that I've seen with this illness have spells, have periods that are like what patients with temporal lobe epilepsy report. So they don't have grand mal seizures and motor seizures, but they have periods when they sort of lose touch with the world and the people around them in a very similar way to people with temporal lobe seizures. And for that reason, the linkage of the human herpes virus 6 to both temporal lobe seizures and to chronic fatigue syndrome is an interesting observation that may be irrelevant, but is provocative, at least to me.